Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this session, which is very, very timely, given the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. I think as you noted in your remarks correctly, out of 55 countries, 54 have signed the agreement establishing the AfCFTA. And as of last week, 38 countries have ratified the agreement establishing the AfCFTA. And this, of course, is a very, very important and symbolic step, ratification by all of these countries, because it means that they have accepted the legal obligations for reducing barriers to trade, reducing barriers to intra-Africa investment, and ensuring that the services sector in Africa is liberalized, and that from a regulatory standpoint, that we have a degree of harmonization amongst the 38 countries who have ratified the agreement. So it is a very, very important step. It is, of course, a first step. The journey is long. We know from the experience of the European Union how difficult and time-consuming and protracted market integration can be. The European Union has been on this road for over 70 years now. Significant progress has been made, but of course we know that there are still challenges. And so similarly, for the context of Africa, we're not a customs union, we are a free trade area, but similarly, there will be challenges, significant challenges, in terms of implementation, readiness to implement the obligations of the agreement, and a range of other challenges that we may not anticipate for the moment. The ambition is simple. The ambition is that in 14 years' time, 97% of goods traded in Africa will be traded at zero duty. And so we have a transition period that we have agreed to, in terms of which the tariff reduction shall happen over a number of years. We have also an attendant mechanism for resolution of non-tariff barriers, because we are aware that you can eliminate tariff barriers, but if the non-tariff barriers remain, the objective of reducing barriers to trade shall not be achieved. The scope of the agreement is very, very wide. It is comprehensive, deliberately so that it captures the universe of a country's economic activity. It covers trade in goods, trade in services. It shall cover, we have started negotiating a protocol on investment, investment protection and facilitation, a protocol on digital trade, on women and young people in trade, on competition policy, on intellectual property rights. And then, of course, there is a protocol on dispute settlement and the resolution of disputes that arise under the AfCFTA. Let me pay a little bit of attention to dispute settlement. When I talk to investors in this capacity, and in my previous capacity as South Africa's chief negotiator, what was clear is that an absence of legal certainty and predictability of market is a deterrent to or a constraint to enhanced investment flows, whether they are intra-Africa enhanced investment flows or in enhanced investment flows from other parts of the world. That certainly this deficit in certainty, in predictability, in the rule of trade law or the rule of investment law, as defined now in this agreement, is something that investors were worried about. And so I believe the dispute settlement protocol is a step in the direction of allaying the fears and addressing the concerns of the investors. We have a dispute settlement mechanism, a dispute settlement protocol that was painstakingly drafted, looking at international best practice, learning from international best practice, what has worked in other parts of the world, what has not worked. We looked at what has worked in the WTO and what has not worked in the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. The basic principles of law are the same. There is a dispute settlement body, and the dispute settlement body will itself consider merits of an injured party or a party that alleges injury. The dispute settlement body shall then establish a panel which shall consider the arguments and the merits from both sides. It shall issue a ruling, and where you don't like the ruling, you of course will have an opportunity to take that on review. And an appellate body, the court of final instance, will be established, and you will then, of course, be expected to bring your measures into compliance after a finding against you by the appellate body. Very, very much the same as in the WTO. The other character that is the same as the WTO is that there is not going to be an investor-state dispute. Just like in the WTO, a party will have to espouse, to petition their government, rather. You will petition your government as an investor in an AfCFTA state party, so that your government can espouse your claim, and the matter will, of course, be adjudicated. It shall be done in by a competent, fair, and technically knowledgeable body of adjudicators. The agreement is very clear that we want adjudicators who know what they are talking about, who are experts in international trade law, in international investment law, or any other area of law relevant to the dispute itself. Now, this, for me, is the heart of how we build investor confidence in Africa. If we are able to demonstrate to the world our commitment to the rule of trade law, the rule of investment law, which are instruments that we have negotiated ourselves in Africa, that to me is the test, the measure. When we apply the rules that we have negotiated for trade law, and we do so over a sustained period of time, to me, this is the measure of whether or not investors will have confidence to increase their investment projections in many countries in Africa. Last month, we convened a meeting of the dispute settlement body here in Ghana, in Accra, an inaugural meeting of the dispute settlement body. And therefore, I believe that we have sent a signal to the world that certainly the African continent and those who have ratified the agreement are very, very serious about and are committed to adhering to the rule of trade law in Africa. Of course, there will be challenges. Of course, there will be, I expect that at some point, some countries will say, we don't like this ruling of the appellate body. We're not going to implement it. We're not going to apply it. We are dealing with sovereign states. And when dealing with sovereign states, they, of course, act in a way that they believe is consistent with their sovereign rights. We know in the WTO that there are countries who don't bother to apply rulings of the appellate body, who ignore rulings of the appellate body. Doesn't make it right, but I don't think we should expect that in Africa that will be different. Sovereign states sometimes will take decisions that are not in compliance with the agreement that they have adhered to or that they have ratified. But the underlying point I make is that we have to work together with investors to make sure that we build confidence in the rule of trade law, the rule of investment law, which as Africans, we ourselves have negotiated. So this is a very important part of the African Continental Free Trade Area. What we seek to achieve is through this agreement to lay the basis for market access, to lay the basis for enhanced investments into different areas of the African economy. For example, we know that in trade supporting infrastructure, that there is a deficit of close to $100 billion, according to the African Development Bank. And this deficit of in trade supporting infrastructure is also an opportunity for investors to invest in infrastructure, to invest in ports, in rails, in roads. It is a very, very important opportunity for investors. But what has been missing is, of course, a continental legal framework that will apply seamlessly across countries and across regions in the African continent. There are also opportunities to invest in financial services, particularly in financial technology, in capital machinery and infrastructure of financial services, which we know in some countries, in some parts of the continent, is required. There will be opportunities to invest in agro-processing, in the automobile sector, in the pharmaceutical sector. We hope that this agreement certainly will create those opportunities for investors to feel confident that now that we have a legal system that provides legal certainty and predictability, that they should now be in a position to invest. It will, of course, be incredibly difficult. As I mentioned earlier, from the experience of Europe, it's going to be very, very difficult to implement an agreement of 38 state parties, which will eventually be 55 state parties, differentials in levels of economic development, differentials in business environment. It's going to be very, very difficult. There will be challenges ranging from readiness of customs authorities to readiness and the lack of trade remedies expertise. There will be very, very significant challenges. I have no doubt about that in my mind. However, just because we shall face what appear to be insurmountable challenges, I don't think that we should not forge ahead in the implementation of this very important agreement. I think on the contrary, because of the difficulties and the challenges in economic development in Africa, because of that is precisely why we should forge ahead with implementation of this agreement so that in 30, 40 years' time, we reap the benefits of an integrated market, and we reap the benefits of a market which now is 1.2 billion people. In 15 years' time is projected to be close to 8 trillion United States dollars. So potentially, this continent can be as competitive globally as India or China. Of course, today we are not as globally competitive as India and China, but I believe that this agreement lays the foundation for us to one day be as globally competitive. We have the market size, we have the population on the continent, which by the year 2050 will be half the population in Africa will be below the age of 25. And as you know, in the year 2019, before the onset of the pandemic, of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world, 6 were on the African continent, growing on average 8 to 9% per annum. At that time, Africa was the second fastest growing region after Asia. And so you can see that there are signals, there are indicators of a potentially very, very lucrative investment market on the African continent. What we have to work on in the implementation of this agreement is to make sure that this agreement enables Africa to advance on the index of ease of doing business, so that small medium enterprises, large investors, entrepreneurs can be able to participate in Africa's economy based on a single set of rules for trade and investment, intellectual property rights, which this agreement sets out in quite detail. And therefore, my hope is that governments in Africa will aggressively implement this agreement so that Africa has an opportunity for a fast post-COVID-19 recovery, so that intra-Africa trade becomes the driver of economic recovery post-COVID-19. And so I thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you some of our objectives, and certainly to share with you my vision as the Secretary General, the first Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks and this interesting speech, and giving a broad and still deep overview of this big project you're facing and shouldering and carrying ahead. So let's progress to our panel discussion. So as mentioned, we collected a couple of questions from the audience and also the more than 300 participants that had registered. So we have our three panelists here. If I see Dr. Mangeni, I've seen you as well. If you don't mind switching on your camera and your microphone, then we'll have all the panelists visible. Perfect. Thank you very much and welcome. So, Dr. Mangeni, as an expert in trade, do you think the African Continental Free Trade Area agreement is the universal remedy for Africa's economic challenges?
Yes, hello there. Congratulations for convening this very useful event after the initial postponement last time. And I would like to recognize my Secretary General, who has just been talking to us, setting out his vision. Yes, it may not be the panacea for all our problems. It may not. But it is the front line of regional economic integration in Africa now. It is the front line for Agenda 2063, which, as you may know, seeks to achieve an integrated, peaceful, prosperous Africa, which is efficacious on the international scene. So in terms of being integrated, the African Continental Free Trade Area seeks to create a single trade regime across the continent. So this is phenomenal, and it's only the African Continental Free Trade Area which can do this. No other instrument, no other organization has this ambition or even the capacity to do what the African Continental Free Trade Area seeks to do in terms of creating a single seamless trade regime across the continent for free movement of goods, services, as well as, of course, the complementary programs for free movement of people. Prosperous in that, I think the Secretary General has set it out very clearly. We expect that when implemented, the living standards of the people on the continent will be improved. The World Bank has estimated that we could pull up to 100 million people out of poverty by the year 2035 if this agreement is implemented. That's a phenomenal statistic, and it really inspires, I think, our public policy leaders, makers of public policy, implementers, to work hard on this. And of course, as you know, trade promotes peace. So this is also going to promote peace on the continent. I think insecurity has been a problem for us. And then, of course, united, we are stronger, 55 countries. So that's actually a large bloc. And in terms of the combined GDP of Africa, we now rank as the 5th largest economy in the whole world. So on the international scene, we would be efficacious. So I would like to give actually an unequivocal yes to your answer. that the African Continental Free Trade Area is our dream come true, is what we have been looking for, what we have been working on since the 50s, the 60s, in terms of political Pan-Africanism or even economic Pan-Africanism. And it has all the instruments in terms of various protocols to make this happen. We have the political will, the momentum around it is quite high. You have heard how 38 countries have already ratified. We've already started trading. 54 countries have already signed the agreement, as you said yourself in your introductory remarks. So I think we are headed in the right direction, and this can work if we really put our act together. Back to you. I think you're muted.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your comments, and we'll get back to that once we go a bit deeper into the discussion. Maybe Peter, you represent and advise various companies across Africa and countries that are in the area of the AfCFTA. What do you think mechanisms will be in which African multinationals can use this free trade area to their advance?
Thank you very much, Max. It's a very, very important question, and I certainly echo what the Secretary General said about the importance of legal certainty and predictability, but there are a number of issues with the African Continental Free Trade Area which I would like to highlight. And maybe we could talk about it a bit more in the discussion. I mean, the one is obviously, and the Secretary General's alluded to this, the idea is that within 5 years, and obviously subject to an allowance for less developed economies, within 5 years, 90% of tariffs on all goods will be eliminated within the free trade area, which is, you know, is a huge change for Africa, given that Africa as a continent has the lowest levels of intracontinental trade in the world at the moment. It's around 15%. But the second issue, which again the Secretary General alluded to, but I think we need to discuss in a bit more detail, is the fact that one of the problems in Africa, certainly in my experience as a lawyer, working, you know, partly in the trade area, is the erection of non-tariff barriers to trade. So, for example, you have the most integrated common market in Africa by a mile is the East African community in East Africa, which the DRC has recently been invited to join, which I certainly think will make given it's an Anglophone community at the moment, including Rwanda, which is today effectively Anglophone, it will certainly be a turn up for the best or the worst, whatever, however you want to look at it. But the point is that EAC is the most integrated market in Africa, yet there are perpetual issues, Max, between Tanzania and Kenya about the export of goods into Tanzania. And non-tariff barriers erected at the border, and there have been other issues with Uganda. So I mean, the elimination of non-tariff barriers, and you know, and I'll talk about this in a bit more detail, the creation of a proper customs procedure to implement the agreement is going to be a huge challenge for the 38 countries which have now, you know, it's a substantial achievement. 38 countries out of 54, 55 have now ratified the agreement. So the other issue I wanted to flag is the fact that, you know, although this agreement kicked off on the 1st of January this year, there is still, as I understand it, not final agreement on the respective schedules of tariff concessions. The idea is that will be agreed by the end of May, and the deadline for completing these negotiations is actually the 30th of June. So we're hopefully 1 month off that. But obviously the issue of, you know, agreement on the tariff phase down, the tariff schedule, and the rules of origin are key. So if I could just touch on the rules of origin, I mean, that's the other issue that clearly has to be agreed, because if you don't have agreement on the rules of origin, you don't have a free trade agreement. And again, the trade ministers have agreed that this will be finalized by the end of June. I mean, I think there was a meeting of the trade ministers in May. Dr. Mangeni can correct me if I'm wrong, earlier this month. But I mean, you know, I think the issue of the tariff phase down and the rules of origin are absolutely non-negotiable and essential. Then the third issue is, you know, what's actually going on at the moment. My understanding is, we talk about this a bit more in the discussion, that there is beginning to be some trade under the agreement itself. There had been, thanks to Ethiopian Airlines, which is effectively the national carrier of Africa these days, there have been goods produced in Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, which have been shipped to various countries, including Ethiopia. And I also understand that two Ghanaian firms, one manufacturer of alcoholic products, and the other one, a cosmetics company, have in fact been exporting their products via air and sea freight since January. But, you know, other than that, I'm not aware of very much going on. And obviously the question then is, once countries start trading like South Africa, Ghana and Eswatini, what do you do about the tariffs you might have paid, which you shouldn't have paid? Again, my understanding is that there will be an application of a tariff rebate in those cases. So, you know, I think there's still a lot to do, and I come back to the point I made about the East African community. Obviously, on the positive side, we now have a situation in between Botswana and Zambia, that the Kazungulu Bridge, which cost $270 million, funded by the African Development Bank mainly, has been opened in the last couple of weeks, and that's going to make a huge difference for goods coming from South Africa up into the rest of Africa. But clearly, for the free trade agreement to work properly, there are two other key elements that are going to have to happen, and they are in fact annexes to the agreement itself. The one is the annex on customs cooperation and mutual administrative assistance, and the other one is the annex on trade facilitation. The first one, the customs cooperation and mutual administrative assistance, also includes regulations around state parties cooperation in respect of customs administration, because if you don't have those things in place, it's going to be very, very difficult to trade under the agreement. And there's also a further annex I just wanted to mention, is the harmonization of international trade procedures, which deals with the whole issue of imports, exports, and transit processes. So it's absolutely key. And Wamkele's talked about this before in some of his media interviews last year. I recall one in the Financial Times, that, you know, unless all these things are set up, the agreement is not going to get off first base. But then, you know, obviously the main question you're asking me, how does this affect the private sector? And I'll give you a very simple example. We are now dealing with a pandemic in Africa called COVID, which started, unfortunately, at the beginning of last year, came from Wuhan in China. How does Africa respond to it? Now, clearly, one of the things Africa doesn't do a lot of, except in more developed economies like South Africa, is produce pharmaceuticals. In South Africa, pharmaceuticals are produced, and as you know, Aspen Pharmaceuticals in what was Port Elizabeth, now Herbert, in the Eastern Cape, is manufacturing the Johnson & Johnson COVID drug. Now, once those issues, once the certification of the Johnson & Johnson COVID drug is resolved, because, as you know, there have been issues in the US, I see, you know, the fact that South Africa has a sophisticated pharmaceutical manufacturing sector, this is potentially transformational for Africa, because the Johnson & Johnson drug, which is recognized by the World Health Organization, by the European Medicines Agency, by the US Federal Drug Administration, by everybody who really matters, you know, Johnson & Johnson could use its base in what was Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape to export the drug into the rest of Africa. on a hopefully on a non-tariff barrier basis, and you know, with no customs duties. So I think this is a potentially a game changer for Africa, because you'll be able to, the private sector will be able to set up manufacturing hubs in the right parts of Africa in order to take advantage of the free trade agreement, and use those hubs as a basis of exporting their goods and ultimately services in Africa. But you know, the thing is, this is a gigantic undertaking, Max, where, you know, we're into a completely new era. But I have to say, I think it's a game changer for Africa. It's a hugely exciting opportunity, and we all as Africans stand to benefit enormously from it. So I'm very excited by it, and I think it's a huge opportunity for all of us operating in the world of international trade and in Africa. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Peter. Lorenzo, as a investor and management consultant and entrepreneur, what positive effects for businesses do you expect based on the experience with other free trade areas around the world?
Thanks, Max. I can only very much echo what's been said, and maybe try and sort of put the accent on a few, let's say, more practically business sort of angles. So I think, let's say, if we look at the history of free trade agreements, I would say, you know, if you look at sort of serious reports and studies on them, I think the overall balance is generally very, 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 very positive for business. We're talking about an increase in export sales, obviously within the trade area, of in some cases up to 50%. We're talking about industries. I mean, as we know, companies and countries can focus more on their specific distinctive competitive advantage, and therefore the overarching efficiency of the trade area increases, because you rely less on subsidies. You also, let's say, I mean, export tariffs are at the end, and import tariff at the end of the day, it's different sides of the same coin, and they are subsidies of different nature after all. And once those are taken out, obviously that amount of money can be used for more productive uses, and therefore create extra GDP. There's a great opportunity to share best practices across the different countries, and that includes the tech transfer opportunities, which is something very particularly close to my heart, and that I think particularly in Africa can increase the speed of development even further, and can be a huge enabler. And if you look at it in very, very simple terms, all of the investments and the economic entities, the economic units that require scale and infrastructure, which has been mentioned by the Secretary General, by Peter, by everybody, really, is a very, very easy win. So the enhancement of investments, both from the private sector and semi private sector in infrastructure, is a huge opportunity that is enhanced dramatically by free trade agreements, and we've seen that in the case of NAFTA, in the case of ASEAN. It's very much to be expected in a very, very similar way, and we've seen some of the few first examples mentioned by Peter already kicking off in Africa. I mean, overall, if you look at, for instance, the example of NAFTA, it's estimated that to have contributed to an annual GDP increase of up to 0.5 percentage point per annum of the overarching area, including the North American free trade area. So I think the numbers speak very, very, very clearly, and both logically and, let's say, analytically and statistically, we can find confirmation of this everywhere. I would like to very much echo the difficulty in implementation and the importance to always, let's say, focus on explaining the different benefits, because it's very easy, especially for, and we've seen that in the integration process in Europe as well, it's very easy for political parties in different countries to sort of drive more, populist narratives that sort of point towards, let's say, either a slowdown or a reversal even of integration processes such as this one. However, oftentimes it's very much of a communication exercise, and explaining and understanding and making sure that private and public sector really do understand the different advantages generated by the integration. So I think let's call it lobbying, but to use maybe but it's really about communication and genuine, simple term explanation of the benefits is, I think, what will really make sure that the implementation of the agreement, which is the most difficult part in this process, will really be successful and be passed and be fast in its implementation. So these are really the kind of sort of few angles that I would like, on the basis of what we've seen in other trade areas happening, what are really the sort of if you wish, do's and don'ts and the key advantages that it created.
Thanks a lot, Lorenzo. In the Secretary General's opening remarks, and also Francis in your points previously, the Secretary General mentioned that there are significant challenges that have to be overcome. Francis, you mentioned that it will work if everybody puts their hands together and goes to work. So Francis, would you agree to the challenges, or do you see the same challenges as Peter Dion or Lorenzo Tencati?
Thank you, Max. Yes, in response to your question, I have got some good news, and then I have got some better news. So let me start with the good news. The good news is that I agree with the points that Lorenzo has made. They really are spot on. Increased trade, technology transfer, investment into infrastructure, as well as tackling or enabling implementation implementation challenges through continuous awareness creation. And I would like to add that what is in the AfCFTA agreement, or the value proposition for the private sector, is that it's going to catalyze policy reforms through implementation and compliance. If you look at all the annexes, including those that Peter mentioned, they will result in policy reforms which improve the business environment or the ease of doing business. And then the dispute settlement system, together with the system on non-tariff barriers, will improve predictability and therefore better planning. It's a large market. It's really a large market, which should support critical levels of investment and promote industrialization. Now, the better news is that I have got some one or two issues with some of the observations that Peter made. First of all, is just a factual correction, is that we are reaching zero tariffs on 97% of tariff lines in 14 years, as the Secretary General said, 14. And that's because the transition periods are as follows. For developed countries, or for the countries that are relatively developed, those that are not LDCs, that are not less developed countries, they have up to 5 years to eliminate tariffs on 90% of the products. But then they have got another 7% of the products that they can designate as sensitive. Now, for these, they have up to 10 years to do so. Now, for less developed countries, they have up to 10 years to reach the 90%, but for the 7% sensitive products, they have an additional period of time. So that's why the Secretary General said we have up to 14 years to reach 0% or 97% of the products. Now, regarding the issue of perpetual non-tariff barriers, as Peter called them, between Tanzania and Kenya. Trade wars, we can call them trade wars actually, as well as Uganda and Kenya. You can also look at Nigeria and Benin, where the border was closed, or even Uganda and Rwanda, where the border was closed. So regarding these perpetual trade wars, I would only remove the word perpetual, because as anyone will tell you, in any organization, whether it's the European Union, whether it's ASEAN, whether it's NAFTA, there will be disputes. And that precisely is why you set up dispute settlement mechanisms. So when disputes occur, it doesn't mean that the system is not working. On the contrary, when disputes occur and you are able to resolve them, then that demonstrates that the system is working within the limitations of human error or human folly. Let's put it that way. Yeah. So I would like to look at these so-called trade wars as isolated instruments. By and large, these systems work, whether it's ECOWAS, EAC, COMESA, or SADC. And if I can give an example of why I hold that view, if you looked at a link or a website with the link tradebarriers.org, that's a system for addressing non-tariff barriers that has existed in COMESA, EAC, and SADC for more than 10 years. You will see that the success rate of removing non-tariff barriers once reported through just clarifications is more than 90%. And we are talking about a total of 700 non-tariff barriers that have been reported over that period of time. So I would argue that actually that demonstrates that these systems for addressing non-tariff barriers do work quite well when used. And once the private sector are aware of it, just like this tradebarriers.org has. If you want, just check it out. The statistics are actually in the top left corner there. Now, the African Continental Free Trade Area system of non-tariff barriers is actually a clone of that tripartite COMESA EAC SADC system. Actually, we just got it from the COMESA EAC SADC system. So I would like to argue actually quite vehemently that the glass is not half empty, maybe it's half full. We can be optimistic that things will work on the basis of the experience that we have seen in the regional economic communities, for instance, the non-tariff barriers mechanisms there, but also on the fact that if you look at the numbers, the number of non-tariff barriers and the number of instances where things have gone well, the non-tariff barriers have actually been just a speck really in the ocean. It's not the norm. It's not the norm. It's rather the exception when they happen. But even between Kenya and Tanzania, I hope you know that as we speak now, there are high-level consultations to address these problems. Even between Uganda and Rwanda, there were high-level consultations to address these problems. Even Nigeria and Benin, there are high-level consultations to address these problems. So it's not as if when there's an issue, there's nothing done about that. So that's what I wanted to say. Then the second thing I want to say is that if you look at the ongoing negotiations, the built-in agenda, first of all, it's not exceptional for Africa. Even the WTO had a built-in agenda, which after 20 years is not yet completed, by the way. Right. Whereas if you look at our track record as the African Continental Free Trade Area, within 5.5 years, we have moved from designing this African Continental Free Trade Area to negotiating it, to concluding the negotiations and beginning to sign, opening the agreement for signature, and then actually ratifying it, entering into force, and commencement of trading within 5.5 years. That's a record time. And as we speak now, on the built-in agenda, regarding the tariff negotiations, we have got 41 tariff offers as of now. I think that's an impressive number. So the negotiations are continuing actually to finalize the rest. On rules of origin, we have done 86% of the tariff lines because we have adopted the product-specific approach. So we have done 86%. Now this is good because actually analysis shows that this 86% of rules of origin cover more than 75% of intra-Africa trade on the basis of the trade that's happening at the moment. So that is actually credible enough on the basis of which to continue trading. So I wanted to say that, again, it's the glass being half full, but maybe not half empty. I think we have done quite well. And on the basis of that track record, we can expect that we shall be able to finalize the negotiations, if not within the time frames. As Peter pointed out, they are approaching very fast. We are just left with about a month. Maybe shortly afterwards, we should be able to get there. But even if, and this is the point, we have a product without an AfCFTA rule of origin, provision has been made for that trade on that product will happen on the MFN terms or the WTO terms, or on the terms of the regional economic communities, assuming the countries trading happen to be in a regional economic community like SADC or ECOWAS or EAC or COMESA. So provision has been made for such scenarios. So I just wanted to say that we can be optimistic. And as I said, this is the better news. It's good to be realistic, and I think Peter gave us that wake-up call, building on what the Secretary General said. He himself said it's going to be tough. There are challenges. It's not going to be easy. But the challenges, however daunting they are, cannot hold us back. We must continue. This is a must-win. There is no failure for this. It's a once in a generation, a once in a lifetime actually opportunity, as the Secretary General himself has said, for Africa to do something about the diminutive markets that the national markets are, in creating a continental market which supports critical levels of investment and which can therefore help industrialization and socio-economic transformation. And I just wanted to end by saying that though it is Ethiopian Airlines which has been helping with the trading under the Africa Electronic Group, and also Ghana has exported some products to Guinea and to South Africa, Egypt as well has done this. So there's actually more trade that's happening than what is recorded under the AfCFTA. But also, let's take into account, if you wanted to be legalistic about this, that the African Continental Free Trade Area agreement makes provision for incorporation on the basis of the principle of acquis of trade regimes under the regional economic communities. So for instance, trade under COMESA, trade under EAC, technically speaking, is also happening under the African Continental Free Trade Area, because that's what the provision says, that what's happening in the regional economic communities will not be rolled back. On the contrary, it will be harnessed, it will be harvested and incorporated into the African Continental Free Trade Area. So this amount of this trade at that level is continuing to happen, and we can also count that within the African Continental Free Trade Area. Let me also just mention that regarding COVID, I'm really happy with what Peter has said, that South Africa, together with Egypt, by the way, and Rwanda as well, are coming on board to help manufacture diagnostics, therapeutics, even vaccines and other medical products. But I wanted to say that if you looked at a platform called the Africa Medical Supplies Platform, and the URL is amsp.africa, you will see that on that platform, there's a lot of trade happening, supply and delivery happening of diagnostic, therapeutics, and other medical products. It's estimated that more than $200 million worth of business has already happened. So this shows what Africa has been doing to handle the COVID pandemic, in addition, of course, to the COVAX facility, which you can also get access to through the AMSP.Africa, the Africa Medical Supplies Platform. You can get to COVAX through this. So in answer to your question, I'm sorry I've taken too long, but I thought I needed to put this on record just to say, can we be optimistic? We shall get there eventually, as we must. There's no other way apart from going forwards and getting there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Francis, to put everything in a positive light and positive outlook, and looking at the glass half full. I'll come back to the glass in a minute, but Peter, do you want to have a quick statement or view on Francis's remarks?
Very briefly, Max. I mean, I don't disagree with what Francis has said. I mean, the two things that really stand out to me, I mean, of course the glass is half full, maybe more than half full. This is a game changer for Africa, as I said at the beginning. I think the thing that stands out to me from what he said, and with which I agree, is this is going to catalyze policy reform in Africa, because African governments are going to have no option once they've ratified the treaty, and 38 of them have, to get their houses in order and change the way in which they trade. The second point I agree with is on the WTO. I mean, the reality is we now have a fantastic new African Nigerian Secretary General, Director General of the WTO, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, and the reality is the Doha round, which started 20 years ago, has been completely stuck because nobody, obviously in the WTO, as you know, you have to have unanimity on any change to the trade rules. So the only changes the WTO has been able to make are changes on the trade facilitation agreement, which came into effect, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, but nothing else has moved. WTO is stuck. So what's happened as a result of that is you've had regional trade agreements being created, say, between Canada and the European Union, and now potentially between the UK and Australia. And you also had 4 years of the Trump presidency, which was essentially very anti-trade in its general approach. So the fact that Africa's managed to negotiate a free trade agreement within 5.5 years is really quite remarkable, given the issues the WTO has experienced, effectively making no progress for 20 years. The other point I would make is that, I think Wamkele alluded to this as well, is that what investors also want, trading companies and governments also want, is regulatory certainty and predictability. And the fact that the free trade agreement has largely replicated the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism and the appellate body mechanism is very positive for governments and for manufacturing companies, because they then have recourse to the mechanisms that have been agreed, and the countries that have ratified the agreement are going to have to, whether they like it or not, implement the decisions of the dispute settlement body. I mean, the other issue, of course, in the WTO, which is only now beginning to be addressed, is that because the US wasn't happy with the decisions of the appellate body, the appellate body effectively became dysfunctional. It doesn't have enough members. Hopefully the Biden administration will now address that, because obviously it is more pro-trade. So I certainly think, in summary, Max, this is, as I said, a game changer for Africa, a huge step forward for the continent, but we need to be, recognize the realities on the ground and the issues we're going to face going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. So Lorenzo, Francis was mentioning the glass being half full, and the Secretary General did mention quite a lot the investment into Africa. So knowing you work with clients and companies that invest into Africa and want to invest into Africa, what do you think they would expect or would require to increase their confidence into investing into Africa, besides the rule of law that has been mentioned before?
Yeah, thanks, Max. I think the excitement is undeniably there. I think everybody is super excited about this, and very much the sort of if you want to say it like that, the proof is in the pudding from an investor perspective, in that they are obviously looking very closely at the first few instances when the trade agreement gets used, and what happens, who sort of respects it, who appeals against it, how the disputes actually work. So I would say there is no real, let's say, a few first movers will have a big first mover advantage, and we'll see, and we start to see some of those. But the biggest chunk, if you want, of the capital will really start to flow once these mechanisms, once the market will have, and in the investor community at large, will have confidence on how does it actually work. Does it work? What happens in a dispute? in sort of in the real world. So I think that's really the only, and that's a matter of time. So it's not. That's why I think it's the glass is definitely half full, and the excitement goes towards testing and proving the broader investor community that these mechanisms work. So disputes are not a problem per se. It's actually how they are handled is actually the real sort of value add of a trade agreement, really. And after all, if we manage to get the Italians, the Germans, and the French all in agreement on trade in one way or another in Europe, I do believe we can be optimistic about Africa as well.
Thanks, Lorenzo. So, Francis, what do you think the private sector can do to be heard in the negotiations and then also in the implementation of the free trade area?
Right. I really like
locally and internationally, I would say.
Right. I really like what Lorenzo just said there, that if the Italians, the French, and the Germans can agree on something, then we certainly have the potential, the capacity to agree. Right. Yes. Thank you, Max, for this important question. Now, I wanted to answer that question by giving, first of all, an example of what's happening. And that example is with regard to the African Association of Automobile Manufacturers in Africa, AAAM. Now, these are, as I said, automobile manufacturers or producers, operators in that sector. And they have formed a continental association. They come from South Africa, Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana. All these countries are represented on that association. And what they do is, first of all, at the national level, they lobby governments. I remember my good friend Peter talking about lobbying governments, as well as Lorenzo. Yes, so they lobby governments. They try to make input into formulation of positions at the national level, but also implementation of policy in order to develop the automobile sector. Then at the continental level, they engage the Secretariat and they produce position papers, which they discuss with the Secretariat. And actually, lately, one of their position papers was actually presented to the negotiations through the Secretariat. So this is an example of how private sector operators can organize themselves as a sector or as a value chain, and then begin to approach government, begin to make input, begin to formulate position papers in order to be heard in the negotiations through presenting those position papers, but also through joining, and this is an additional point, their national delegations into the negotiations. There should be some room for private sector operators to be included on the delegations of the governments into the negotiations. So having given that example, I would like to say that we have had this experience, even in the regional economic communities, in various negotiations on various issues, controversial issues such as sugar, where the private sector can actually make a robust input. For instance, they can have their own meetings, private sector meetings, produce a report, and then that report can be a position paper which they can put. So to summarize that, I hope it's coherent enough, is that they can act at the national level during the point of position formulation through engaging governments. They can act within the negotiations themselves through submitting position papers, and they can also act at the negotiations themselves through being part of the negotiation teams. They can be consulted in the course of the meetings themselves by their heads of delegation or members of the delegation to inform the negotiation. So this is what I wanted to suggest that they can do. But in addition, look at what we are doing here, Max. So I believe you are from the private sector now. Yes. So I think private sector operators can also organize events like this one. And today, by the way, this is about third I'm participating in such an event. One was actually organized by people who do fair trade. from the standpoint of a local community, actually, where they put out their views, they engage government officials, secretariat officials, and other stakeholders among themselves to put out their views, to discuss matters, seeking to be heard, seeking to know what's going on and what role they can play. So these events, like the one we're having here, are very much to be encouraged as part of that process of knowledge creation, awareness creation, and creating ownership on the part of the private sector as well of the African Continental Free Trade Area, so that you know it and can use it as service providers, whether it's in the services sector, in the area of trading goods as well. So that's what I can say. I think there's an important role for you to play as private. Yes.
Thanks a lot, Francis. So let me quickly sum up what I understood from the discussion so far. So I guess we all agree that the African Continental Free Trade Area, it will be a game changer for Africa, but not only for Africa, but also for the world. And if you look at the vision, $8 trillion of economy within the next 15 years, following a Chinese and Indian example, definitely lets the hopes up and gives a positive outlook, and not just a positive outlook, but actually a lot of excitement. Also considering that it will be able to bring up to 100 million people out of poverty. And the expected benefits are that the tariffs will be reduced on 97% of the goods within 14 years, and already 90% within 5 years. Countries are expected to have an uplift in GDP, as we've seen in other free trade areas. There will be tech transfer, best practice transfer. So there's a lot of interesting opportunities that will come up for countries, private and public sector. And as the Secretary General mentioned, the heart of the African Free Trade Zone will be the rule of law and the confidence, the investor confidence. So there are a couple of challenges that are still to be overcome: the increase of in ease of doing business, harmonization of regulations, but eventually building trust. So I would also like Lorenzo and Peter to share your closing remarks in 3 sentences from a corporate and from a legal perspective on this agreement and on your discussion today. Lorenzo, please.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Sure. No, very quickly. I think thanks, Max. I think you've encapsulated very well the key points. I mean, the only sort of wish I'll leave this audience with a big wish, which is really one of taking one of really studying and communicating, thinking about how we communicate the benefits and the sort of all the sort of the details of the agreement to the various governments and stakeholders, so that we don't run the risk, or we at least limit the risk of populist sort of protectionist narratives to kick in and slow down the process. I think this will be the most difficult hurdle, and the one that we need to all sort of work. So let's really bring the facts and science ahead, and let's make sure that we tell the full story and we learn from past experiences. That's the wish that I would like to leave the audience with, and thanks again for the participation, and thanks again to His Excellency the Secretary, and to Francis as well.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Peter, your 3 sentences as closing remark, please.
Yes, I will be very succinct, or I will try to be. I mean, the couple of points I would make. One is, the huge scope for policy reform as a result of this agreement. The second, though, I think from a business perspective, is enabling business to increase economies of scale by promoting commercially efficient regional and global value chains. The point I made about pharmaceuticals in the Johnson & Johnson case, encouraging product market competition, which is often absent in Africa, and facilitating innovation and greater technology uptake, which is also extremely important. And if I could just close on an advertising note, my firm, Herbert Freehills, has acted in every single African country we've had mandates in. So that's quite an achievement, and we've been doing so. I haven't been part of it, but we've been doing so for the last 40 years. So we, as a firm, we're very heavily invested in Africa, and we opened our first Africa office in Johannesburg in October 2015. So we're very excited to be part of this journey with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and the agreement. Thank you, Max.
Thank you, Peter. Francis, any last 3 sentences as closing remark from your side?
Yeah, maybe what I could say is just to thank you. So what I could do is just to thank you for organizing this event and for inviting us as Secretariat. It has been an absolute pleasure to participate and to hear what you had to say, what Peter had to say, what Lorenzo had to say. I think it's very encouraging for us as Secretariat to see the interest on your part as the members of the private sector. You know, the willingness to take up opportunities that open up and the African Continental Free Trade Area. So we are very much encouraged, and we would like to encourage you to continue doing so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all the participants, His Excellency Wamkele Mene. Thanks a lot, Dr. Francis Mangeni. Thanks a lot, Peter Leon. Thanks a lot, Lorenzo Tencati. And thank you very much, everybody listening in, participating, and submitting your questions. Thank you very much.